across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Dr. Merrill Matthews.
And welcome to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews, sitting in today for Kirby Anderson. We live in a world where there is competition. Competition for our worldviews, competition among competing theologies, competing philosophies, competing values. How do Christians meet that challenge of competing ideas in the marketplace of ideas? And how do we impart those biblical views to our kids and our friends? We're going to answer some of those questions for you today. Joining me in studio is Charles Stolfus. He is the equipping pastor at Denton Bible Church. He's been with us several times in the past. He got a bachelor in music from North Texas State University. He has a master's in theology from Dallas Theological Seminary, and he specialized in historical theology. And he serves at Denton Bible Church, and he is the director of their theological Institute. Charles, thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here.
Okay, we're talking about worldview, and you teach worldview to high school kids and other kids. Start us out by telling us, what is a worldview?
Well, I think the simplest definition of a worldview is a view of the world. It's how we view the world. It's not simply what we see, but how we make sense out of it. And so my thought is, and as I've learned from others, is that there are basic presuppositions about the nature of these critical issues in life. They help frame our view of the world. Mm-hmm. I think a good analogy for that is a set of eyeglasses. A set of eyeglasses, they're called corrective lenses for good reason. They don't alter reality. What they do is they help me see reality as it really is. And so a worldview, or a frame of reference that is built and constructed by our answers to certain prior fundamental presuppositions, helps, whether you realize it or not, whether you do it intentionally or not, whether you do it right or wrong, whether there's a mixture of error or truth, this all goes together to frame how it is that we see the world. Again, the goal in life for a Christian, and should be for everyone, is to see things as they really are. In other words, as a Christian, we're not really trying to indoctrinate people into some obscure philosophy, but we're looking to the Word of God that gives insight into the true nature of reality. And so worldview helps us do that.
So how do we impart this worldview to other people?
Well, one thing, you don't do it accidentally. It's something that if you leave it to the accidents of chance, then you're going to get it wrong every time. If you aim at nothing, you're going to hit it every single time, as the saying goes. And so I would say you have to very intentionally focus on what I mentioned earlier, those basic prior fundamental aspects of reality. And I think I've learned from others that have gone before me, James Sire, one of the great writers on the subject of worldview, where he identified 7 of these basic fundamental questions that, again, help frame our understanding of reality. So we start there on those basic questions, and we say, where does the evidence lead us in that area? The question of God. Is there a God? And if so, what is he like? The question of the nature of physical reality, the universe. Has it always been here, or is it the product of some kind of a designing intelligence? The nature of human beings. Are we the latest evolutionary ancestor of a lower primate, or are we the special creation of an all-wise, all-good God? And then issues of morals and ethics, and the question of evil and suffering, and the question of life after death. And then the last question that he identified was, really, is there any meaning at all for history? Mm-hmm. Is it meaningful or meaningless? And what he means by that, it sounds a little bit kind of esoteric, but it's really a rather simple thing. When we think of time, of history, the past followed by the present that will lead inevitably into the future, is there any meaning to that? Is it going anywhere in particular, or is it just simply one thing after another, like Henry Ford said? It's one darn thing after another.
I think many times people sort of keep their various views in silos, but with a worldview, it's all interconnected, isn't it? My view of God, my view of the Bible affects what I think is right and wrong, affects what I think about how I got here, where I'm going. All those things are interconnected, aren't they?
That is so true. Everything matters. And that seems like a simple statement to make, but everything matters, especially in the realm of worldview, because like you said, even with respect to those 7 vital questions, those fundamental questions, what you believe about God affects your view of the universe. What you think about God affects your view of man, of morals, of evil and suffering, of life after. I mean, all of those fundamental questions are interconnected. So a compromise over here is going to show itself as a compromise over there. And so we have to, throughout life, aim at getting these basic fundamental questions correct. And again, for all of us, we're in process. We're all growing and hopefully getting a clearer understanding of those fundamental aspects of reality that help, again, frame our view of the world, so that when we wake up in the morning, the way we view what we see has been affected by our decisions yesterday and last week and last year. Again, our answers to these basic fundamental questions.
Now, you've been teaching worldview to, I think, high school students or students for like 15 years, a long time, haven't you?
Yeah, I have.
So how did you start doing that?
Well, I have a job at Denton Bible Church. I'm a pastor there, and I worked in an institute there and did a lot of other things, kind of wore a bunch of different hats at the church there. And I was approached by some people that said, hey, listen, our students have been going to another worldview class. We'd like to do something closer. And so this was a worldview class that really was based upon a curriculum that called Worldviews of the Western World, that's by a guy named David Quine, who's out of Richardson, Texas, actually, right down the road from where we are right now. And they said, would you be willing to do that? And I approached the elders, and they said yes, and the rest is history. And so I had to really, well, it was a significant ramp up, because it is a very extensive worldview course, a 3-year course that really goes to the original sources of Western philosophy and art and music and sculpture and philosophy and literature.
Politics?
Politics absolutely is a huge, huge part of it. And so what we do is we trace out worldviews as they're reflected in a succession of periods of ancient human history. So starting with the Hebrew Old Testament, followed by the period of the Greeks and the Romans, and then the Christian era, then the Middle Ages, and then the Renaissance and the Reformation, and then following that on into the modern era, and now here we are in the postmodern era. And again, tracing how worldview is reflected in these various venues. Again, literature, art, music, etc. Because it is that. What we think is reflected many, many times in our creative venues.
We're going to come when we come back from the break. We're going to sort of walk through this summary that you have here of these classes and why you focus on what you do there. And we have your syllabus available on pointofview.net. If our listeners want to go to it, we can go to pointofview.net. We have a link there for that. It's a 6-page syllabus, so it's extensive, and it's something which tries to bring people in touch with various aspects of our history and our culture as it is affected by the Bible.
Absolutely.
So we want you to stay with us. When we come back, we'll continue our discussion with Charles Stolfus, who is the equipping pastor at Denton Bible Church, and our discussion of worldviews and how to teach that to kids. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
The school year has ended, and we will soon find out how many students were missing and how many school desks were empty. I was unaware of the problem until I read the op-ed warning, "The empty desks are telling us something." The latest data from 39 states and the District of Columbia found that 23% of students were chronically absent in the 2024-25 school year. The percentages for the most recent school year will likely be similar. When state legislatures have addressed this problem, they threaten students and parents. They threaten students with the loss of a driver's license. They threaten parents or students with fines or even jail time. Apparently, the carrot, graduate and get a meaningful job, has given way to a stick, threaten them. Let me suggest something else. Perhaps the public schools aren't providing an educational experience that students value. Students in the inner city unfortunately receive an inadequate education, as illustrated by virtually every test administered over the last decade. Even students in better schools must wonder why they must sit in boring classrooms when just a few years ago during the pandemic, they were told to stay home and try to learn online. As the attached op-ed reminds us, boys don't do as well in reading as girls. They have more learning disabilities, and they are more likely to be expelled. They may need more help, but often they are the least likely to receive it. Chronic absenteeism in this light is not merely a failure of discipline, it is a performance review. Perhaps that's why more than 1 million students left the public schools for private schools and homeschooling. These empty desks are telling us something. I don't think many educators are listening. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today, and joining me in studio, Charles Stolfus. He's the equipping pastor at Denton Bible Church, and for 15 years, he has been teaching worldview classes to high school students. So if you have a high school student, if you're homeschooling, you may want to pay close attention to what he's doing here, because what he's talking about is how you impart a biblical view of the world that integrates into all aspects of our thinking. So Charles, sort of walk us through the curriculum here.
Sure. As I mentioned before, the backbone of the curriculum is a syllabus that was developed by a guy named David Quine, and his whole family was involved in the development of it, and it's been really operating for quite some number of years. And it's entitled Worldviews of the Western World. And what it does in a 3-year curriculum, it works through chronologically through various periods of world history, especially in the West. And it starts with the ancient Hebrew Old Testament, and we study the books of Genesis, and especially Job and Genesis, as we see worldview from the Old Testament Jews reflected especially in those particular books. And then followed by that in the first year is the period of the Greeks and the Romans. And we see worldview reflected in, let's say, the writings of Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, or Virgil, the Aeneid. And then we move on into the New Testament, where we look at the New Testament era and see worldview reflected in especially the 4 Gospels and the book of Romans. And then we end the year with a briefer focus on the Middle Ages, which is that age in between the Christian era and the next period, which will be the Renaissance. And so that's year 1. And then year 2 is basically the first half of the year is focusing on the Renaissance and the Reformation, and then studying original sources, and we're looking at art and music and literature, and we're seeing again how worldview is reflected in those particular creative outlets. Again, part of what we're doing throughout the entire course is we're learning how to analyze worldview as reflected in another culture or even our own culture, and then we're hopefully developing an understanding of what would be an accurate understanding of a worldview. So again, that second year really focuses initially on the Renaissance and the Reformation, and then the second half is loaded. It's called the revolutions, and we trace through 5 particular revolutions in worldview, starting with the English series of revolutions, followed by the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and finally the Scientific Revolution. And we see worldview again reflected in these critical ideas that are developing throughout that period of time and how it all is connected.
Yeah, I was going to say, all of these, you've got these 5 major revolutions going on that are reshaping the way the world thinks about things, but they're all connected in various ways, but they're not all, they weren't all engendered by the same ideas.
That's exactly right. In fact, some of them are exactly the opposite. So you're going to see a commonality in the English Revolution, followed by the American Revolution, but then all of a sudden you're going to see starkly contrasted the French Revolution, which was kind of rejecting just about everything that the English and the Americans embraced, and really starting with man as man. And then a similar sense, you're looking at the Russian Revolution, which is a kind of an atheistic revolution in worldview. And then finally you get to the last revolution is the scientific revolution, which is basically a whole-scale rejection of God largely. I'm speaking in generalities, but it's a rejection of God and an embrace of materialism. The idea that matter and energy are the only realities and there are no higher invisible realities at all. And so that worldview is viewing all things through the lens of a materialist philosophy. So that's year 2.
And, it's interesting because if you're moving to the scientific worldview, you're abandoning the notion that the Bible is truth and now science becomes truth.
That's exactly right. In fact, you trace out, it's fascinating to trace the kind of the connection where you have a strongly theistic worldview reflected in the Christian era and as well as even the medieval period. And then with the Renaissance, a kind of a secularizing trend that initially doesn't wholesale reject God, but it basically diminishes the significance of God and increasingly is critiquing God and revelation, and increasingly over time, over several hundred years, really continuing to view things through the lens of materialism until you get with deism in that period of time, as well as eventually you get to the atheism, a whole-scale rejection of God. But again, you see kind of an evolution there. Until you get into the materialist revolution there, and then also the postmodern period where it's almost the complete...
There is no truth.
That's right. It's the complete loss of meaning and value, and everything is arbitrary. And postmodernism is that there are no truths. All there are agendas. It's manipulation. It's control, and so it's a wholesale rejection of the idea of objective truth or even objective reality.
But it becomes individual. I have a truth, but my truth may not be your truth, and I can't condemn your truth, but even if it's not my truth.
Yeah, so you highlighted one of the critical problems with postmodernism, no basis from which to discern or discriminate between what's right and wrong. If everything's right, then nothing is right. And so that's the really devastating consequence of postmodernism. And then the effects of postmodernism, where it atomizes people, it separates people. We basically, when we conflict, then we kind of separate and move away from each other. And so one philosopher said there's the loss of intimacy, the possibility of intimacy, because you're kind of a god to yourself. And so now it's all about power. When there's a conflict in worldview under the postmodern system, it's really all about power and manipulation. That's who wins.
Well, if we as individuals are the source of our truth, then it would make a certain amount of sense that we feel like we are a God in some sense.
Yeah, and isn't it interesting that was the error from the very beginning that Satan tempted Adam and Eve with? That he basically tempted them with, you can act independently of God. You can be God, as it were. And then we see the devastating consequences that immediately rippled out from their tragic choice, rejecting God and embracing their own view of reality.
So you had the first year and the second year. What about the third year?
Yeah, third year is where we get into the idea of, let's say, the Enlightenment, where it's the Renaissance with the exaltation of reason, but then it basically is more of the same. It's more of this kind of an atheistic perspective on the nature of reality. So we're tracing out the great philosophers in the Western tradition and seeing how they kind of they're basically struggling with meaning and purpose. And some of them say reason is the primary tool by which we can know the nature of reality. And then others come along and say, no, it's not reason, it's experience. And so experience is the way you can know the true nature of things. And then guys come along and say, no, it's not reason or experience alone, it's actually both. And then finally, almost as if mankind is exhausted, you come with Hegel, and it's almost throwing up his hands and saying, while we might get closer and closer to the truth, we will never get there. And so Hegel in the 19th century is followed by the 20th century, where we have kind of a despair. In fact, Francis Schaeffer describes philosophy after Hegel as philosophy descending below what he called the line of despair, meaning that they came to grips with the idea that maybe there is no possibility of knowing truth at all. And so what happens in the 20th century with existentialism and nihilism and all the other ichasms and spasms, as some have described it, is efforts to find meaning and purpose in a universe that they're convinced there is no meaning and purpose. So let's arbitrarily find it with existentialism. Or let's throw up our hands and say, listen, come to grips with the idea that there is no meaning and purpose and just kind of deal with it. And then if you don't believe that, then you've got mysticism and all the other things in the mid to late 20th century, which were efforts at finding meaning and purpose in the absence of any philosophy or theology that would give meaning and purpose.
And some of these times sort of led to a reversal and people embracing Christ again.
Yes.
And the Jesus movement in the 70s.
Absolutely. That's really one of the interesting things, that the devil thinks he's got, a success, and then all of a sudden people come to grips with the idea that apart from God there is no meaning and purpose, and then many times they can turn to Christ. They can turn to God. I would agree.
When we come back, I want to ask you, do high school students, are they interested in this? Do they find this compelling? Are they able to grasp it and understand that? And then have you explain a little bit about how people who don't have a seminary background can work with their kids to gain sort of the knowledge of this and begin to impart it to their kids, either at homeschool or to their kids who are going to traditional secular school and then come home and then want to hear from the parents about their responses to that. My guest for this hour, Charles Stolfus. He is the equipping pastor at Denton Bible Church, and we're talking about his 15 years experience teaching worldview classes to high school students. In our world, there's not much more important than being able to raise up some high school students who understand a proper biblical worldview. We'll be back on Point of View in just a minute.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. That scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, Dr. Merrill Matthews.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today, and we've got in studio Charles Stolfus, who is the equipping pastor at Denton Bible Church, and we're talking about his 15 years of teaching worldview to high school students. And so, Charles, one of the questions I have, we're talking high school students, and we're talking about some what I find very interesting, but do high school students, do they find it interesting to talk about Plato and Aristotle and Virgil and the Renaissance and the Reformation, and can they grasp those things?
Well, first of all, can they grasp them? Absolutely, yes. I think we expect far too little from young people. They're definitely able to kind of process this, but it is a developmental process. So when we get them in the very first year, they may have difficulty in kind of grasping some of these ideas, these worldview ideas, but boy, very, very quickly, they get up to speed and are able, over a 3-year period of time, are able to cultivate some really good abilities to critique, to evaluate, to weigh evidence. And we do it in a context of very interesting things. I mean, in the first year, we're looking at the book of Genesis, the creation. We're looking at the book of Job, and we're talking about evil and suffering. And that's kind of it's a fascinating subject that everyone's going to deal with. Or we're reading the Iliad and the Odyssey, and these are like really kind of crazy stories that, again, we're seeing how worldview implications are reflected in the Greek poetry. And then we also look at the philosophers. Like, listen, you're looking at Plato's Republic, read the entire Republic. And boy, if you think that is a boring book, you haven't read the Republic. It's really a fascinating book. It's about a totalitarian system that he has constructed as a way to what? Best reflect justice and ultimate truths, and yet everyone loses their privileges. We have a section there where we focus on the family according to Plato's Republic, and you say, you mean kids are taken away from their parents and they're put in rearing pens? That the men and the women, they do athletics together and they wrestle in the nude. I say, whoa, but the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, the Gospels, and then so forth. How about this? Philosophy. On the third year, we read many of the great philosophers, their ideas, not huge amounts of that, but enough to get a sense of what they are. Then we read a novel called Sophie's World. And it's a crazy, convoluted storyline about a girl that starts receiving letters, and then you find out eventually that she's getting a lesson in philosophy. And the whole book traces out the history, the development of philosophy from the ancient Greeks on to the modern postmodernists.
And, it's important because, and I used to teach philosophy back years ago, but one of the things that happens is you're confronted almost every day with issues of what's right and what's wrong. What should I do? What should I not do? And having some kind of background in that you've thought through these things, and maybe in a class you talk with other people and you discuss this and you find out why they believe this or why they think that, and then you put in your ideas, it helps you sort of formulate those ideas.
It sure does. You know how to talk about things that really everyone has kind of thought about. What's the true nature of reality? What's the difference between a thing in and of itself and my perception of the thing? I give the analogy of a mirage. When we're out in the desert and we see a mirage and we think it's a lake, is the lake really there? Is the mirage really there, or is it some sort of a phantasm? Or is it physically explained by heat, reflecting off the pavement and stuff like that? But again, you see very quickly how this is relevant. A person's perspective doesn't control. The thing in and of itself controls. All of us have to wrestle with the difference between how I see a thing and the thing in and of itself. And it's relatively easy to get people up to speed on that critical issue.
And one of the things you do is you have to try to challenge people. I know in the philosophy class I used to bring in, when we would deal with the issue of truth, I would bring in an article from the Dallas Morning News and an article from News of the World that I would pick up at the local 7-Eleven. And one would have a story from the Dallas Morning News, and the News of the World would have something about 5 aliens being captured here. And I'd ask them, which one do y'all believe? And they would say, well, we believe this one in the Dallas Morning News. Yeah. Why?
Yeah.
You don't know the authors of either one of these. You don't know, there's a paper's been around for a while, but why would you believe one and not the other? And it forces you to sort of think, why do I accept something as true and something else as not true when I don't have really any experience with either one?
Absolutely. And again, one of the things I love about the Worldview series is that you're working through actual worldviews as reflected by people we disagree with, maybe even very, very strongly. But in the process, and this is a significant part of this 3-year process, you're teaching young people, again, a freshman, a sophomore, a junior in high school, teaching them the tools by which they can evaluate a worldview or these questions. In other words, they're learning critical thinking skills as they're learning history. It's not simply now they know some details about Plato's Republic or they know the storyline of the Aeneid. It's rather, even more significantly there, over a 3-year period, they're developing the skill to really analyze and critique, and then hopefully at the end of the series kind of say, well, this is how I see things. Mm-hmm. Again, if they've developed a proper worldview grounded on the true nature of things, now they're able to see things clearly, again, as they really are. And again, that's a high school student that is able to do that.
So let's say I'm a parent and I'm homeschooling.
Yeah.
We have a lot of homeschoolers who listen into the program. But I don't have the background in philosophy and I don't have the background in theology. How do I begin to sort of bring this into my kids that I'm homeschooling when I just don't have that strong of a background?
Yeah, that a lot of parents have that same question. And even when their kids come home from a worldview class and they're talking about this, that, or the other thing, and the parents are kind of scratching their head, they don't quite even understand what their kids are thinking there. Mm-hmm. What they don't fully realize is that we have a really successful way of shepherding these young people along, from the very beginning, developing these abilities to critique and evaluate, but we're doing it in the context of literature and philosophy and art and music, and they're being brought along, and I think an adult can do the same thing. And again, I have to give credit to David Quine and his curriculum, Worldviews of the Western World, again, out of Cornerstone Curriculum in Richardson, Texas there, that he's done an incredible job in a 3-volume set of syllabuses, whereby it's a syllabus that's about an inch to an inch and a half thick, mm-hmm. where all the reading and the evaluation of the student is being written down in that syllabus. They bring that to class, and now we talk through what they learned as they read through many times those original sources. Mm-hmm. And so, again, you do that over an extended period of time, and now you are developing the skill to understand that. And again, it's a great literature. And again, not only great literature, but the sources that it's linking to, from Francis Schaeffer to James Sire to great novelists to Homer. The reason why we're still reading these guys, Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, and it's because they're so good. Because I tell the students, even where they're wrong, they're most often brilliantly wrong. And so we can learn much from reading and evaluating and critiquing these wrong views, and then to hopefully shepherd them on into the truth.
What if I'm a parent and I have a kid who goes to regular high school, and I want to be able to interact on this, but I don't have 3 years to devote to this? I have dinner every night for a few more years before they're going to college. How do I interact with that?
Yeah, there are good resources that I could point people to, and I wouldn't mind if they wanted to reach out via email and ask some of the sources. I'm happy to provide that in response to that. But again, take advantage of those that have gone before us, that have done the hard work, the yeoman's work. A lot of what we start with is James Sire's The Universe Next Door. Mm-hmm. He's kind of updated that, slightly altered that somewhat in his more recent book, Naming the Elephant. But James Sire, very, very gifted in that. And then a lot of the things that I supplement the worldviews of the Western world with are these sources that are more modern sources that we're reading about, intelligent design. design. Reading Darwin on Trial by
Philip Johnson.
We're reading Michael Behe's stuff. We're reading other material that's written by Bill Dembski, these modern thinkers that have done a really, really excellent job in breaking down some of these very, very critical ideas. And then I think a lot of Francis Schaeffer. He was a very gifted Christian philosopher, especially popular in the 60s and 70s before he passed away, but again, wrote many, many great works. Again, they're kind of difficult to work through, but they're doable. You're able to do it.
We'll be back with our final segment with Charles Stolfus in just a minute.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back with our final segment with Charles Stolfus. We're talking about teaching worldview to high school students, but we don't have to just restrict that to high school students. You can get access to Charles's curriculum on our website, pointofview.net. We have a link there. It's a 6-page PDF document. You can download that and take a look at it. We also have his email up there if you want to reach out to him, because he has resources that he can send you by email. So you feel free to reach out to them on our website, from our website, the email address there. And Charles, we were talking about parents and how parents can talk to their kids even if they're not homeschooling. And there are some resources for that, isn't there?
Absolutely. Some of the books that actually the students are reading are the greatest sources for them to kind of get up to speed. They're very, very understandable by a lay man or woman. I think the other thing that I want to give a shout out to, first of all, I already mentioned the Worldviews of the Western World by David Quine. His whole family was involved in that. But his son, Ben Quine, has put together, he and his wife Julie have put together a really wonderful volume called The Biblical Worldview Primer. And it's really specifically for parents that would like to get up to speed, that maybe don't have 3 years to devote to this extensive worldview education there. So it's a wonderful, very, very well-produced, beautiful artwork in there, but again, very well done. The Biblical Worldview Primer by Ben and Julie Quine. And so that's a great, great resource for them.
Now, you do this, you're equipping pastor with Denton Bible Church. You do this as your role as a pastor there. Should churches be engaged in this? Is this part of equipping the saints in the broader sense?
Absolutely. In fact, our theme for our church is taken from Ephesians 4, that we as leaders within the church are for the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry. So yes, it's true that the central theme of the Bible is Jesus Christ and Him crucified. He is the means by which we can be saved. That is the big idea among all the other big ideas. But there are the other big ideas that we are in the business of really cultivating. And so I would argue that the church at every level of education, from the children's ministry to the senior citizens, is in the process of cultivating a biblical worldview. And I know for a fact that our pastors and leaders at our church, again, from the Learning Center on up through middle school and high school and college and into senior citizens and married and unmarried, at every level, what we are doing is cultivating a biblical worldview. And again, the Bible speaks to those fundamental questions. It is the infallible resource that we have. We have a word from God. And so that is what we preach and teach. And so in the process over time of exposing the Word of God to people, they are indeed, whether they realize it or not, are growing in their understanding of the true nature of reality as framed by God's answers to the basic fundamental questions of reality.
Now, Denton Bible Church will have separate classes, and you'll advertise these. We're going to be doing such and such.
Right.
Should churches do something like that, you think?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I remember years ago when I was actually finishing my music degree at University of North Texas State at that time there. But I said, I read a book by a guy named it was a last name of Green, and it was called The Greening of the Church by Findlay Edge, I think it was. And he said the church should be a mini theological seminary. In other words, we should be providing these kinds of classes for our people who are very intelligent. It's just that many times they're not biblically grounded because they haven't been to seminary. But we who have been to seminary have the great privilege of really now introducing all of our people to these great ideas and the coherence of the biblical message. Not just simply believe this or else, but really, this is why you should believe it. It's right. It's correct. And these things help us see things as they really are.
So we've been talking about how parents can reach out to their high school kids. But your point, I guess, is that pastors can be reaching out to parents or to high school kids and providing that function themselves.
Yes, that is what we are involved in. Yes, we're preaching the gospel, but we're also cultivating a biblical mindset on marriage, on the arts, on education, on every critical fundamental question that we concern ourselves with all of the kind of the controversy that rages around the country and the world. God has something to say about these things. And even in a system, a program like this where we're learning, historically what happened when the English, starting with the Magna Carta over several hundred years, develop into a representative kind of a democracy. I say, how did that happen there? Well, that really helps us understand how we should see the role of government. And again, the Bible speaks to that.
It's interesting because we've got an election coming up here in a few months. And so being able to bring a biblical view to your understanding of government and how that government should function, how your political representatives should function.
That's right. And when we encourage our people to vote, we don't have to tell them who to vote for or what to vote for if we've done our job at really helping them understand truth as it's revealed in the Bible and what we should expect of leaders and how it is that government is a minister of God for good and it punishes evildoers, it rewards those who do good. And if we have done our work well, all we have to do is say, get a strong encouragement, vote. And what we're telling them is, vote your biblical convictions, and we'll be okay. I heard someone say, I think it was actually Ted Cruz's father, Rafael Cruz.
Who's a pastor?
Yes, who's a pastor. And he actually spoke at Denton Bible once, and he said, you know what? Only half of Christians register to vote. And of those half of the Christians that register to vote, only half of them end up voting. So 1/4 of Christians end up voting at all, and then you have to kind of siphon off some that vote probably incorrectly because they weren't well taught. But again, you can see a really significant impact on a culture if our people were trained well, and then we just kind of send them out into the world to be Christ to the world. I mean, in fact, that's what our calling is. That I remember John MacArthur saying this, that we gather for edification, and sometimes we get bandaged up, and we get corrected, and we get exhorted, but then we go out and scatter into the world, and we are Christ to the world. On our jobs, at school, in society, in other groups. That's what we should be doing.
And it includes having an answer to some of the questions that people ask you, given about your faith and why you believe what you believe.
Exactly. Apologetics is not only commanded that we should be ready to make a defense for the hope that's within us. That's what Peter said. We should earnestly contend for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. That's what Jude said. But it's modeled everywhere. It's Isaiah saying, "Come, let us reason together," quoting God. It's Jesus who engaged those that were so violently opposed to him. It's Paul who is engaging those that are so dead set against what he was preaching. Again, we could go on and on. It's modeled and it's exhorted and challenged for every single believer.
My guest for this hour has been Charles Stolfus. He is the equipping pastor at Denton Bible Church, and we've been talking about worldviews and how you teach that to your high school students, but not just them, to other people, to members of your church. You can find that syllabus at pointofview.net. charlestolfus.net, and I'd encourage you to go there. You also can find his email address if you have questions for him. And look over that syllabus. You'll find it very, very interesting. And I'll second what you said about Francis Schaeffer. He was so good at being able to integrate Christian worldview into the ideas that face us now. When we come back, we're going to talk to Seth Troutt. He is the author of Authentic Masculinity. If we have a problem in this world today right now, it is the issue of masculinity. He's going to tell us what authentic masculinity is. Stay with us. We'll be back on Point of View.
Will the American experiment endure? As we approach the 250th anniversary for our nation, we must recognize the answer to that question largely depends on us. In 1789, President George Washington said something important. He said, "America is an experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people." That means that our actions, our values, determine the course of our nation. Washington also argued that we can't expect blessings if we ignore God's moral order. If you want to help the American experiment endure, if you want to restore the moral foundation that made this nation strong, partner with Point of View. Your support equips listeners to live according to God's moral order and defend freedom for the future. Give this month and your gift will be doubled. Call or click today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Dr. Merrill Matthews.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. Joining me in studio is Charles Stolfus. He is the equipping pastor at Denton Bible Church. And Charles, I was looking at the Wall Street Journal yesterday, and one of their columnists, Elisa Finley, had an article, and the title is Taylor Swift Sings About Graham Plattner and Donald Trump. That caught my attention. And it starts out by saying, did Taylor Swift once date Graham Plattner? He is the Democratic nominee for the Senate in Maine. And she goes on to say, not has been reported, but her songs about dissolute men do echo accounts of women who dated the Maine Democratic Senate nominee. And she goes on to say, one could easily fill a book with anecdotes from friends about men who don't measure up in any way to a man. And I looked at that and I thought, gee, that just sounds like just what we're talking about in this hour. Joining me by phone is Seth Troutt. He is a teaching pastor at Ironwood Church in the Phoenix area, metro area. He's been pastoring full time since 2011, and he has a PhD, a doctorate in digital technology, Generation Z, and gender identity. Interesting thing to have a doctorate in. And he's joining us to talk about his new book, Authentic Masculinity: Leaving Behind the Counterfeits for God's Design. Seth, thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you, gents. Thanks for having me.
Now, tell me, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, so I grew up going to church, had a pretty good dad, pretty good mom. I got saved probably my junior year of high school at a winter camp. So I'm a church kid and started serving in the church, just playing in the band and helping with small groups and kids ministry and stuff. And then probably when I was about 19 in college, I recognized that I was supposed to go be a Bible teacher. Went to Phoenix Seminary. My church hired me full time and supported my seminary efforts. And now I've been at Ironwood Church about 10 years. My wife and I've been married since 2013. We have 2 kids, a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old.
Now, you have written the new book, Authentic Masculinity. What gave you the idea for writing this book?
Well, the big thing, I got like you mentioned, my doctorate was in gender, which is mostly trying to explain why Gen Z was so vulnerable to the transgender ideology and how digital technology affected that. And so that was more about trying to help the church think broadly about problematic views of gender, the ungodly views. And what I was naive about was presuming that young folks who were raised in the church and had godly parents would be somewhat inoculated to some of the cultural lies. But I remember talking to a group of middle schoolers at my church at one of the winter camps I was preaching at, and a group of them had been watching Andrew Tate videos, and I hadn't really heard of him at the time. The first time I saw his stuff, my brother sent it to me and said, "Get a load of this guy," and I thought it was a joke. Half of what he said was like really obvious and great. Quit smoking weed, get out of your mom's basement, work hard. And I was thinking, this is great. And then the next things he would say were like, marriage is a trap designed to domesticate men. You should have children with as many women as possible. I could call it like a Genghis Khan vision of masculinity. Sex, money, power, go and get it. Anything else is bad. And recognizing that some of these middle school Gen Z guys were caught up in that. And then shortly after, a buddy of mine who's a pastor of a church that has, about 500 college students, asked me to come teach. Can you come do a talk on why Andrew Tate sucks? That was the title he gave me. And
that should get some attendance.
Yeah. And, a lot of guys came, but I had to create a model that was going to help these guys think through God's design for masculinity that they could evaluate other designs against. Because it's one thing to critique what is bad in culture. It's another thing to cast a positive vision and help people understand the real thing and do the compare and contrast. And so that talk became an article, and that article became a book, and that's why we're here talking today.
We've heard a lot about toxic masculinity here recently. It's been a topic that's been discussed significantly. How do you contrast authentic masculinity with toxic masculinity?
Yeah, so on the front end, I want to say that I really do not like the term toxic masculinity. I think it kind of misses the point of what the people are trying to talk about, because when I think about toxicity, the dose makes the poison. You can get water poisoning from drinking 2 gallons of water in 90 minutes, or you can get fentanyl poisoning from a few tiny little micrograms. And so the dose makes the poison. And so when we're talking about toxic masculinity, a lot of people are, in a sense, implying that these people are excessively masculine. And the solution is there then to, tamp down or limit the masculinity. These womanizing chauvinist types, they're excessively masculine. And I want to say, absolutely not. The God's design for masculinity, that has to do with humility, discipline, responsibility, chivalry. We are not suffering from an excess of that. And so I want to, I have empathy for why people want to talk about toxic masculinity. Males using their power for bad or self-serving reasons is a problem. But I also think that more than that, what we're lacking in the culture is healthy, Christ-like masculinity. And I want to call people towards that.
Wow. Seth, this is Charles Stolfus. Just a pleasure to be here, and I really enjoyed your book. One of the things I liked about it is how simply it is organized. It seems to be in like 2 major sections there. You're focusing on masculine virtues, what it means to be a man in terms of virtue, but then also about masculine roles. I guess the setting in which we see a true or authentic masculinity that lived out. Could you talk a little bit about these masculine virtues that you reference?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Actually, what you mentioned, the structure of the book, is the thing I'm the most proud of, because that's what I found really scales when fathers are passing on to their sons, and it really helps people grab hold to it for conversation's sake. And so, that first part is the masculine virtues, which is really rooted in negation. And so there's a 4-layer pyramid here. So man is not God, so he must be humble. And that humility is twofold. One, that we are creatures who are in submission to reality, that we are not the creators. God's the creator, we are creatures. But then also we're sinful creatures who are indebted to God's grace. And so that kind of thick vision of meekness, the broken and bridled horse, Matthew 5, poor in spirit, that a godly man must be humble because he's not God. And then a layer up from that is that man's not just a creature, but he's fundamentally distinct from all the other creatures. Animals are ruled by instincts and desires, ring, bell, drool type Pavlov thing, whereas man and God's design are supposed to have moral vision. We let our greater desires supersede our lesser ones. On a really base level, I want to eat 12 donuts, but more than that, I want to function in my work all day long and not have a stomach ache, so I don't do that. Greater desires supersede lesser desires, and as we discipline those desires, they come into conformity with God's heart over time. The layer up from that is that man is not a child, man's not a boy, so he must be responsible. Especially, we're supposed to resist the blame shifting that we see from Adam in Genesis 3 and take responsibility. And the man's not a woman, so he must be chivalrous.
Seth, hold on to that. We'll be back from our break in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
The school year has ended, and we will soon find out how many students were missing and how many school desks were empty. I was unaware of the problem until I read the op-ed warning, "The empty desks are telling us something." The latest data from 39 states and the District of Columbia found that 23% of students were chronically absent in the 2024-25 school year. The percentages for the most recent school year will likely be similar. When state legislatures have addressed this problem, they threaten students and parents. They threaten students with the loss of a driver's license. They threaten parents or students with fines or even jail time. Apparently, the carrot, graduate and get a meaningful job, has given way to a stick, threaten them. Let me suggest something else. Perhaps the public schools aren't providing an educational experience that students value. Students in the inner city unfortunately receive an inadequate education, as illustrated by virtually every test administered over the last decade. Even students in better schools must wonder why they must sit in boring classrooms when just a few years ago during the pandemic, they were told to stay home and try to learn online. As the attached op-ed reminds us, boys don't do as well in reading as girls. They have more learning disabilities, and they are more likely to be expelled. They may need more help, but often they are the least likely to receive it. Chronic absenteeism in this light is not merely a failure of discipline, it is a performance review. Perhaps that's why more than 1 million students left the public schools for private schools and homeschooling. These empty desks are telling us something. I don't think many educators are listening. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back with Seth Troutt. He is a teaching pastor at Ironwood Church in Phoenix. And we're talking about his new book, Authentic Masculinity, Leaving Behind the Counterfeits for God's Design. And Seth, you were talking about responsibility when we had to take our break. So go ahead and pick that thought up.
Yeah, so man's not a child. He has to be responsible, not blame shift. And at the top of the pyramid is chivalry. Man's not a woman, so he must be chivalrous, which is showing strength and honors. 1 Peter 3:7, live with your wife in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel. And how that's rooted in biological difference. Peter's getting at the vessel and how the difference in vessel creates an additional layer of responsibility for the man. So those are the virtues: humility, discipline, responsibility, and chivalry.
You know, Charles and I were talking during the break. You start off with humility, and we both really appreciate that because of the lack of humility. But you stay on page 28. There is no such thing as a self-made man. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean that if we believe what Ephesians 2:10 says, that God prepared good works for us to do ahead of time, that we should walk in them, that God has designed us to do specific things in specific ways. And so my intellect, my body, my family history, my training, all of that is made possible by the God who placed me in households and in situations that help me grow and develop. And on top of that, I think one of the most disbelieved verses in the Bible is John 15. Apart from me, you can do nothing. I'm the vine, you're the branches. And that if a man can't understand kind of the heart of the Gospel of John, the heart of Jesus' teaching, we're totally going to miss the mark on what we're trying to be as men. That we can't say, I've made myself. No, we are saved, we are created, we are designed, and anything good in us is derivative and given to us by the Lord himself.
Yeah, I just wanted to probe a little bit more how critical humility is when we see God saying through Isaiah, to this individual I will look, to him who is humble and contrite of spirit and who trembles at my word. Or we look at the example of Moses, the great, great leader of 2 million people coming out of bondage and slavery. Moses was a humble man more than any man on the face of the earth. And you say, can you kind of give us some insight into why it is humility is so essential for a man to be successful the way God wants him to be successful?
Well, I think at a basic level, this is just about dealing in reality, that if we want to be sober-minded, we must live incongruent with what is true about the whole world. And God is the creator, and we are creatures, and we are specifically made creatures. And haughtiness is glory stealing, and attention-seeking behavior is worship stealing. And so the lack of humility isn't just like about falling short on a virtue per se, but it's actually about committing the very sin that made the enemy of God the enemy of God, trying to steal worship from the Lord. And it's highly offensive to him, and it's one of the ugliest things we can do, because to take people's eyes off of God is to cause them to look at something less beautiful, which is us. And so it's harmful to other people. It's folly. It's actually absurd to walk around with a swagger that's not somehow explicitly derivative of creation and grace.
So as you say, it's like to take people's eyes off of God, but then also, in addition, to place it on themselves. So in that sense, it's almost, not to overstate the case here, but it's satanic. It's what Satan did when he said,
Absolutely.
I will be like the Most High God.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one thing is wild. You mentioned Moses. When Moses in Numbers 12:13 is described as the most meek man on the face of the earth, is that Moses wrote Numbers. And you kind of go, how is that possible? How could some guy call himself the most humble in writing? But he took that text to the community, and the community verified that claim. So it was a well attested to reality that here's a man, Moses, who understood his weakness, understood his limitations, understood his sin, and recognized that God nonetheless had great things to do through him, but it was God doing it through him.
Seth, in your segment on discipline, you say man is the moral animal. And then you make a statement I find really important. An animal is not at war with itself, man is. And we often feel that sense of being at war with ourselves.
Yes. I think a big part of Christian discipleship is maturing our desires. When Jesus comes to the disciples in John chapter 2, and he says, what are you seeking? Like, what do you want? I think that's a tell to us that part of what Jesus is going to do is work on our wanter. He's going to heal and mature our desires. But we have this sinful flesh that's at war within us, and we have this controlled by the Spirit that's doing battle. A dog is not wrestling, should I eat the food or not? But yet humans in moral and non-moral ways are at war. And I think recognizing the need to fight that fight, John Owen's famous phrase, be killing sin or it'll be killing you. And I think that is true in 1,000 ways in every man's life.
Wow, I'm just thinking as you were speaking there, I said even Plato said that really the primary goal of education is to train the desires, that people don't desire the good. And so he is wrong in many ways, but I mean, he's right in that we need our desires trained to desire the good.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what the psalmist is getting at when he says, delight yourself in the Lord and he'll give you the desires of your heart. That is not God is a genie, you rub the lamp and he gives you what you want, but it's as we behold the Lord, he implants new, holier, healthier, more mature, more godly desires in our heart over time. And so for guys who have tons of internal battles, whether it's with lust or greed or things like that, part of what we have to recognize is that as we worship the Lord, he will heal us of those things bit by bit over time, even though they will never go fully away until Christ comes back or we die.
You know, Seth, one of the troubles we see in our time is that so many men, young men especially, lack discipline. They want to spend their time playing video games. They don't want to work. There's no ambition. And you mentioned two different types of discipline. Explain those two types.
Yeah, there's physical discipline and spiritual discipline, and those are like the two broad categories. And I think physical discipline obviously has to do with diet and exercise, but also has to do with work ethic, the capacity to resist the vice of sloth and instead work hard. You know, I think one of the things the book of Proverbs makes clear a bunch of times is that one of the ways you bring shame to yourself and your family is by being lazy or being slothful or a sluggard. And then spiritual disciplines are the more explicit habits we build that develop our life with God in a more obvious way, whether it's Bible reading or prayer, church attendance, service, fasting, silence and solitude, things like that, that help our souls grow, not just our bodies and our bank accounts.
And what do we do with kids who just simply don't want to, there is no discipline, there's no ambition, there's no desire. They just don't want to get out there and begin doing things. These, I say kids, but I'm talking about males.
Yeah, I think there's two parts of this. Number one, I think is most important, which is vision, this belief that God can and will do meaningful, great things through your efforts. I think a lot of what guys lack is the capacity to think, what could God accomplish through me 10 years from now if I invest in myself, if I discipline myself, if I grow? You know, nobody who became a medical doctor, you know, took a 2-month crash course. You know, that's a long path you have to walk to eventually be an agent of healing. And so I think guys need vision, and they need mentors, and their parents in particular, to help them identify their strengths and skills and help them understand what it might look like to pour gas onto that little flicker of a flame that is in them and to run hard after things. But I think that lack of self-efficacy, that lack of belief that I could actually accomplish something meaningful, it's just disbelief in my view of how God designs every person with a substantial purpose. So that's like number one is vision. Number two is I think there is like a dopamine digital doom loop thing that I think we have to detox from. It's easier than ever to be a lazy bum in world history, you know, because you can be permanently entertained, and, you know, the nanny state will take care of if you don't work. You know, the American government's not going to let you starve. You know, a couple hundred years ago, if you didn't work, you starve. And now the government will take care of you. So there's less of like a pressure to do that Genesis 3, by the sweat of your brow, you'll bring forth things to eat from the ground. And so I do think there has to be a separation and a dominion we exercise over digital technology that young men face with great severity like never before in world history.
When we come back, we're going from the break. We're going to look at this issue of responsibility that Seth highlights and the role that people have of being responsible. We have information about his new book, Authentic Masculinity, on our website at pointofview.net, and I'd encourage you to go there, and I'd encourage you to pick up a copy of the book because this hits some of the key issues that we are facing in society, especially now as we've turned away from a God vision and people are beginning to just trust in themselves, and in doing that, they're losing their ambition, losing discipline, and losing responsibility, always wanting to blame other people and never taking responsibility for themselves. Stay with us. We'll be back with Seth Troutt in just a minute.
Who can you trust? Years ago, many of us could probably have provided a fairly long list, but today,
Well, today it seems we almost can't trust anyone. Educators don't even know what a woman is anymore. Many so-called public servants have shown all they care about is themselves. The FBI has been accused of bias, law-breaking, betrayal, and journalism. It's largely corrupt, with no Clark Kent standing up for truth, justice, and the American way. All of this is why Point of View Radio is more important than ever, and your part in supporting us is more needed than ever. Do your part today in supporting trustworthy truth. Stand with us and help push back the lies and the darkness. Visit pointofview.net. Don't put it off. Take a moment right now and click on that big blue button that says Donate Now, or call to invest at 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, Dr. Merrill Matthews.
And welcome back to Point of View. My guest for this hour, Dr. Seth Troutt. He is a teaching pastor at Ironwood Church in the Phoenix metro area. And we're talking about his new book, Authentic Masculinity, Leaving Behind the Counterfeits for God's Design.
Seth, as I hear you talk and read your book on what is authentic manliness and the call that is made to all men to be men, to act like men, I can't help but note the stark contrast with childishness. And so can you speak a little bit more about that contrast? What is it that keeps guys childish and impulsive and all the other things that we, adjectives that we use to describe what a child does?
Yeah, the childlike spirit on the one hand is praised, but childishness is obviously a huge problem. And I think about meltdowns, I think about blame shifting, I think about short-term thinking. You're really trying to maximize pleasure in a moment. And I think part of the reason we see so much of it nowadays is because of things specifically like pornography and video games, which are fake sex and fake wins, fake war, fake victory, that they've been conditioned from a young age to seek out those kind of phony, counterfeit versions of accomplishment and connection. And then that is superseded onto things like, financially speaking, when you have the DoorDash problem, people blowing through money so fast, having food delivered, so they're too lazy to cook. They're also very interested in sports betting over and against earning a living. And so there's just this short-term thinking that I think marks childishness, spending money you shouldn't, the lack of prudence. And it's really the markers of folly that you see throughout the book of Proverbs. It's this naivety and this capacity, or this lack of capacity, to think about the future you and think about the current you, and to let current you make bad decisions that harm future you. That'd be my summary of what I think a lot of this childishness, especially in guys who are still in their 20s, looks like.
Seth, you talk first about the virtues in the book, and then you talk about the roles that men play, and you break it down to son, brother, maker, husband, and father. Why is it important to address these roles?
Well, I think if you could probably tell, I kind of got a little pyramid addicted in writing the book. But that second pyramid,
they're actually good. They were helpful, though.
Oh, I hope so. But I do think the order matters, and so many men, I think, end up having dysfunctional marriages or being dysfunctional in work because they haven't dealt with the son layer first, which has to do with taking inventory of the good and the bad that you got from your parents. Being mindful of generational patterns, recognizing that some of that baggage is good, some of it's bad, but trying to recognize that part of being a son is trying to be better than your father. And I mean that as honorably as possible. My father set me up for success, and I want to improve on his legacy spiritually, financially, emotionally, relationally, friendship-wise. And so being a son is about becoming the type of man, a wise man to be proud of, stewarding family history. And you're a son before you're born. You're in the womb, you're a son. And so that's got to come first. Otherwise, you just repeat and rehearse generational patterns of dysfunction. Then brother is about fraternal connection, friendship, loving and supporting one another, relating to women as sisters in all purity, like 1 Timothy 5 tells us to. Maker is really about what does it mean to absorb the weight of the curse in Genesis 3. By the sweat of your brow, you bring forth good things from the earth. To eat, the pressure to provide, to subdue and dominion, to honor the Lord with our creativity and our efforts. And then husband, how do I cherish and nourish a wife like Christ does the church? And then father, how do I pass myself on biologically, obviously, as we have kids made in our image and are also in God's image. But then even more than that, spiritually, as I hope every young man aspires to be elder qualified, even if he never holds the office of elder, in the way he passes on the faith to the next generation.
Yes. Seth, you also seem to be concerned that too many men don't really make good male relationships. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I remember reading an article in the Boston Globe a while ago that describes male loneliness as an epidemic. This is probably 2018, something like that. And I've heard people joke before that the biggest miracle Jesus ever pulled off was being in his 30s and having 12 close friends. And I empathize with that to some degree. A lot of my peers who are trying to be really good husbands, trying to really be good fathers, trying to really be really good employees, they feel like they have to become worse at one of those three things in order to maintain meaningful male friendship. And so I put together this acronym, RAILS, rhythm, affinity, intensity, longevity, and spirituality, to hopefully help men think creatively within the margins of their life on how they can invest in high-quality male friendships that last a lifetime.
Do we need male friendships? Is that important?
I think that Jesus calling his disciples friends is a big tell on part of what Jesus wants us to see. I think you look at David and Jonathan's friendship in the book of 1 Samuel and how David would not have made it were it not for Jonathan's friendship. I think about the call to have iron sharpening iron and how that requires proximity and trust to sharpen one another, and just this need to relate to each other as brothers, which I think, functionally nowadays is more of a friendship dynamic. I think you have a very hard time obeying a lot of the one another's in the New Testament and growing as a disciple without allowing the teachings of Jesus to play out, be fleshed out, and be worked out in the context of intimate male friendship.
Seth, do male relationships look different than female relationships? I mean, man to man, woman to woman. I mean, I think sometimes guys feel the pressure from maybe a wife or a girlfriend or something to kind of almost have a kind of a relationship that they have with girlfriends as opposed to the way guys tend to relate. Is there something to that?
Good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's so much variability within men and between men, and so I think all men will have slightly different flavors of relationship. I think generally speaking, women begin their relationships face to face. They go to coffee, sit down, and get to know you, whereas men tend to form friendships shoulder to shoulder, participating in our activities together. A lot of my good friends, I met at the gym or met doing a hobby or met in a class. And so shared activity is usually how men friendships begin. I do think eventually men need to be able to have what I call intensity in their friendships, which is being in touch with each other's hopes, dreams, fears, insecurities, their shame, confessing sin to one another. But male friendships tend to start and develop shoulder to shoulder and eventually go face to face as there's more a need to sharpen one another and disciple one another.
Seth, there are churches that and various para-church groups that try to get men together in various kinds of large groups to share, to pray, to do various things. What do you think about those?
Oh, I think anytime you're getting men together to pray, you're not going to hear any criticism from me on that effort. I think that's a wonderful thing to do. I think as men grow spiritually together, that's also a great incubator for how friendship develops. I think a lot of men are hesitant to do that because their wife tends to be more biblically literate than they are, because they've been doing women's Bible studies while the man was at work. That type of dynamic plays out. And so there needs to be more of an acknowledgement and a bit of an on-ramp. A lot of guys come in and feel dumb and feel like they don't know what's going on, especially newer converts. But I think getting men together to pray and read the Bible is kind of the bullseye from which everything else emanates on that really Christ-like male connection.
Seth, you speak about how important the role of work is and handling money. Can you speak to that, maybe how critical that is and how it is so easy for guys to get some of that wrong? Yeah,
the credit card debt situation in the United States, just as a political side note, is a disaster. Yes. It is, we kind of speed the leader, speed of the team, $33 trillion in debt as a nation, and that bleeds down and is modeled for households. And I think that men living beneath their means is one of the main ways that we can resist the consumeristic spirit of the age and being content, as we're called to do throughout the New Testament, that contentedness. And I think that a lot of male depression is really kind of downstream from things related to work and money, this kind of feeling of powerlessness, impotence as a way of relating to the world. And, when God put Adam in the garden in Genesis 2, the first problem we see is that there is no man to work the ground. So God put the man in the garden to work it and to keep it. And so I know Christians are in favor of saying we should not find our identity in our work. And I think, yes, on the one hand, we need to find our identity in Christ, period. But a big part of our creational identity is that we are to be laborers, workers, people who apply creative force to the world around us and to make things better. And so trying to completely divorce a man from his work in terms of identity is, I think, contrary to the spirit of what we see in Genesis chapter 2.
We have on the phone with us Dr. Seth Troutt. We're talking about his new book, Authentic Masculinity. You can find a link to that on our website, pointofview.net. When we come back, we'll hit the last two areas of his book, being a husband and being a father. Two extremely important biblical positions. So stay with us. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to our final segment with Dr. Seth Troutt and his new book, Authentic Masculinity. And Dr. Troutt, we've got two segments left in your roles, husband and father, that I want to make sure we touch on. And you had a statement in the husband section where you said, the question is not, will you be the head, but what type of head you will be. Very interesting. As a husband, talk about that.
Yeah, well, understandably, people read Paul's statements about headship in the New Testament and our modern sensibilities go, huh, what is that? And then sometimes what happens is guys go home and then they assert this, and Paul is saying, I got to be the head. But I see that Paul is more observing Paul is observing that reality, not even necessarily prescribing that reality. I think that observation is rooted in natural law and in the created order. But I do think what he's getting at here is, and let me define for you what headship looks like. And he points us to Christ Jesus, who, being in the form of God, did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped or leveraged, but made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant. And what a privilege it is to image Christ in the way we serve our bride like he did. And that husband piece, I think, is vital to God's design. And it's also it's rooted in creation, but it goes past creation to new creation and the picture of the gospel. And so I think men wooing and then serving their wives is such a wonderful opportunity. And I think that's one of the things that young men need to be given a picture of is, people are delaying marriage later and later. The desire for marriage is lower and lower. But going, don't you see that this is not merely about conforming to God's design, but there's also a wonderful privilege to get to love a wife like Christ loved his bride, the church. And it's really an adventure and a joy. And I hope that young men get excited about it, not just like, oh, here's another Christian duty.
Is the way the world going creating challenges for that? I mean, in years past, it would be the male most likely who had been to college or who had a PhD or a master's degree or an MD or a law degree. And increasingly, you have women who are taking those roles, and maybe the husband doesn't. If you're a truck driver and you're married to a PhD, is this a challenge in the society we live in now?
Oh, for sure, it's a challenge. My wife and I were just recently watching the Ed Sheeran documentary. And Ed Sheeran's wife, has a great degree from Duke and a career in finance. And then she gets married to Ed Sheeran, and she has to make this choice to leave behind her career aspirations in order to become a wife who's a full-time mother. And I was mostly impressed that she made that choice. Obviously, when your husband's Ed Sheeran, maybe arguably one of the most famous people ever, it's kind of an easier sell. But we do see that there's like a sunk cost fallacy thing in young women who have more career aspirations than they have home aspirations. And I think that's difficult for men to work with. But I do think, just jokingly speaking, when my younger sister met her person she's getting married to, she was similar, an attorney, a big career, but then she met a compelling man, and she made comments like it was almost like some of that feminism left my body when I met a man who was worthy of following. And I appreciate that malleability there. But I think men, rather than kind of lamenting that or complaining about it, go like, well, I want to be a man that a woman, not all women, that a woman would be honored and excited to follow after. And so the bar is raised on men a bit, which is hard, but all at the same time, we don't choose the cards we're dealt, we just play them.
Seth, as we think about the critical role of being a father, some of us benefited from a great influence from our fathers and father figures, and yet many, many people, in maybe increasing numbers, have never seen what a godly father is. Or, an individual that's caught up in the childish kind of slavery. How do they start? How do they even start to move outside of some of these blindnesses that they've grown up with?
I think the main thing you have to do is acquire to yourself a tribe of mentors, of father figures that you see things in them that you really want to be like. I see his marriage, I see his work, I see his parenting. And I think being a part of a local church is the most healing thing you can do if you've been unfathered or underfathered. And I think at a first point, I would say, if you recognize that, you are already in a good place. A lot of men never recognize that, and they just rinse and repeat what happened to them, and they bail on their wife or kids, or they completely lean out and stay passive. And so acquiring a tribe of mentors through a local church, asking a guy to coffee, asking a guy if he can talk on the phone, leaning into the pastors and elders where you go. I think when you begin at a deficit because of what your father did or didn't do to you, there is more work there that has to happen for you to become a healthy Christ-like follower. And I think that's not fair. It's not your fault, but it is your responsibility as a man to break that pattern and to be the type of father that your kids deserve, even if that's substantively different than what your father was.
Paul lists in one place a number of characteristics, and then he says, but the greatest of these is love. And I'm wondering, of these 5 roles, son, brother, maker, husband, father, is there one that you think there's the greatest of these is this role?
I think that on the one hand, the most important is the son, because it's the foundation. And I think this desire to bring honor to your family name energizes a lot of the other 4 roles, and in the healthy sense, trying to go like, I want to steward the gift of life that my parents gave me as a son as best I can. That's foundation. But I'd argue that probably the most generationally significant one is father, when you're establishing these generational patterns, passing on the faith to the next generation, that you are discipling and investing in your kids and other people's kids, participating in the mission of God to make disciples of all the nations. That when we conceive of that as a fatherly activity, I think that father is the most significant game-changing role, and especially the week leading up to Father's Day. I'm so grateful for all the fathers out there who are fighting the good fight and showering their kids with affection, blessing, and correction. And I hope the Lord, through His Spirit, helps them in their task.
Good point. We don't have much time left, but of those 5 roles, is there one that we as a society are failing at more than the others?
I'd probably say the father one. I think it's hard to go on the internet and not read something about an epidemic of fatherlessness and the crime rates of underfathered men, and how fatherlessness is related to poverty, and just every basically negative symptom you can think about, culturally speaking, is downstream from poor or absentee fathers. And so I think one of the ways that we can shine like stars and even help people come to faith is by being good fathers. We've seen people come to the church because they want to learn how to be dads, and then meet Christ after the fact, because the wisdom of God even came before their understanding of the good news in Jesus. And so I think the church has a wonderful opportunity to help call men to be great fathers.
Well, Dr. Troutt, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your book. It is very, very instructive, and it's a great add to the books, and we would encourage people to go out and take a look at it. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, gents. This was a great conversation.
Great.
Our guest for this past hour, Dr. Seth Troutt. He's a teaching pastor at Ironwood Church in the Phoenix metro area, and his book was Authentic Masculinity, Leaving Behind the Counterfeit for God's Design. And Charles, I thought he just did a great job.
Oh, wow. He speaks with such clarity on this, and what a devastating problem it is, but like he says at the very end, what an incredible opportunity for someone who recognizes their need, and then now they begin the journey to really fulfilling what it means to be authentically manly as God designed it.
In an age where we talk so much about toxic masculinity, authentic masculinity is something we need.
Yeah, amen.
Well, thank you, Charles, for joining us, and thank you for listening. If you want to find out more about Dr. Troutt, you can find his book on a link to our book on our website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Megan for doing the engineering there and for Steve for producing. I want to thank you for listening. And if you go to pointofview.net, there is a donate button there. I'd encourage you to click that and donate to the ministry. Thank you so much for joining us. Point of View will be back tomorrow.
Will the American experiment endure? As we approach the 250th anniversary for our nation, we must recognize the answer to that question largely depends on us. In 1789, President George Washington said something important. He said, "America is an experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people." That means that our actions, our values, determine the course of our nation. Washington also argued that we can't expect blessings if we ignore God's moral order. If you want to help the American experiment endure, if you want to restore the moral foundation that made this nation strong, partner with Point of View. Your support equips listeners to live according to God's moral order and defend freedom for the future. Give this month and your gift will be doubled. Call or click today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.